The private investigator's invoice had the wrong date. Such a small thing, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. But Ethan's attorney was looking, and in the suffocating silence of the downtown courthouse, that single discrepancy detonated like a bomb. Lorraine sat perfectly still in the witness box, her Chanel suit immaculate, her posture regal as always. She'd been explaining, with that practiced maternal concern she'd perfected over decades, how she'd only wanted to protect her son, how she'd hired the investigator purely out of love, how the evidence of Nadia's supposed infidelity had devastated her to discover. Then the attorney placed the invoice on the projector. The date glowed against the white screen. 3 weeks before Nadia and Ethan had even met. The courtroom seemed to inhale collectively. Ethan's face drained of color as he stared at the document, then at his mother, then back again. The forged letter sat in evidence bag 12, the one Lorraine had tearfully presented 2 months ago, the one that had destroyed his marriage in a single night. The timeline was impossible. The truth was suddenly, horrifically clear. Lorraine's fingers tightened on the witness box rail. For the first time in Ethan's 34 years, he watched his mother's mask slip. Not crack, slip entirely. The controlled expression faltered, reformed, faltered again. Her mouth opened, but the explanation that had always come so easily, so convincingly, refused to materialize. Ethan felt the floor tilt beneath him. Every fight with Nadia, every accusation he'd hurled, every moment she'd begged him to listen, to trust her, to believe in them rather than manufactured evidence. All of it replayed in fast forward while his mother sat frozen, caught in a lie so elaborate it had required forethought, planning, and a ruthlessness he'd never imagined her capable of. Hello, everyone. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. If this is your first time here, welcome to Stories That Matter. Stories about real people facing impossible choices. If you've been here before, welcome back. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Because this is a story about truth, manipulation, and the courage to choose love over control. It's about what happens when the person who raised you becomes the villain in your story, and the woman you destroyed was innocent all along. But to understand how we arrived at that courtroom, with a mother's betrayal exposed and a marriage shattered by deception, we need to go back 6 months. To a charity gala where Ethan first saw Nadia across a crowded ballroom, and everything that should have been simple became catastrophically complicated. The pediatric oncology ward at St. Catherine's Hospital smelled like antiseptic and hope in equal measure, and Mira had learned to love both. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside bed 7, where Lily was supposed to be resting but had instead dumped an entire box of crayons. Across the linoleum, the 6-year-old was bald from chemotherapy, her skin translucent enough to trace the blue veins at her temples, but her concentration was absolute as she selected each color with the seriousness of a master artist. This one, Lily announced, holding up a purple crayon, is for brave days. And this one, she grabbed yellow, is for when I'm scared but pretend I'm not. Mira reached for the silver locket at her throat, the one she never removed, the one containing a faded photograph of a boy with her same eyes. Samuel had been 8 when leukemia took him. 22 years later, she still wore his memory against her heart, still chose to spend her days with children fighting the same battle he'd lost. What about green? She asked, pointing to Lily's favorite color. Green is for people who make me feel safe. Lily looked up, her expression far too knowing for someone who should be worried about first grade instead of white blood cell counts. Green is for you, Nurse Mira. Something tightened in Mira's chest. That familiar ache of loving these children, knowing she might lose them. She'd built her entire adult life around this ward, around making scared kids feel protected even when their bodies were betraying them. It was the one place she felt completely, authentically herself, not diminished, not wrong, not constantly falling short of impossible standards. The door opened, and Daniel Cross stepped in, looking like he'd aged another year since morning rounds. He was a widower, a software engineer who'd rearranged his entire career to be present for every treatment, every setback, every small victory. His eyes were kind but perpetually exhausted, shadowed by the weight of loving someone he couldn't save through willpower alone. "How's my girl?" he asked, his voice soft, crushing Her color theory, Mira said, standing and brushing crayon shavings from her scrubs. She'd had countless conversations with Daniel over the past 4 months. Medical updates delivered gently, coffee shared in the cafeteria during Lily's procedures, the unspoken solidarity of two people who understood that some fears were too big for words. Her phone buzzed against her hip. She glanced down at the screen. Another text from Ethan, asking if she'd confirmed attendance at his mother's dinner. The third reminder today. She felt the familiar weight settle over her shoulders, the heaviness of returning to Pacific Heights where everything was beautiful and nothing felt like home. Daniel noticed her expression shift. Long day? No, they're all long, Mira said, but she smiled because Lily was watching, and children always knew when adults were lying about being okay. Lily held up her drawing, a house made entirely of green. This is where Nurse Mira lives, she announced, because she's always here, out of the mouths of children. Mira stayed late again that night, long past her shift, because leaving meant returning to marble floors and imported lilies she was allergic to but never complained about, to a husband who wore his wedding ring on a chain under his shirt instead of on his finger where the world could see it. Have you ever felt more yourself at work than at home? Let me know in the comments, because Mira was about to discover that the place you feel safest can't protect you from the people determined to destroy you. The Pacific Heights mansion was everything Mira had never wanted, and everything she'd agreed to anyway. She pushed through the front door just after 9, her scrubs traded for jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, and was immediately greeted by the scent of imported lilies arranged in crystal vases throughout the foyer. Her eyes watered instantly. She'd been allergic since childhood, but she'd stopped mentioning it 2 years ago when it became clear that Lorraine's aesthetic preferences outweighed her physical comfort. The marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting, reflecting a version of herself that looked small and out of place, a nurse practitioner playing dress-up in a billionaire's home. The house was silent, except for the distant sound of fingers on a keyboard. Mira followed the noise to the study, where she found her husband exactly where she'd expected, behind his mahogany desk, still wearing the charcoal suit he'd put on 14 hours ago, his tie loosened just enough to suggest exhaustion without actual vulnerability. He didn't look up when she entered. The distance between them could be measured in feet, maybe 12 from door to desk, but it felt like years, like decades, like the entire gulf between who they'd been and who they'd become. "You're home late," he said, his eyes still on his laptop screen. Lily had a rough day. Mira leaned against the doorframe, unwilling to cross into the room uninvited. Her counts dropped again. The sound was acknowledgement without engagement, the verbal equivalent of a polite nod at a business function. His phone buzzed on the desk. Singapore, the screen read, and he glanced at it with more attention than he'd given her entrance. Mira's gaze dropped to his collar, to the place where she knew his wedding ring hung on a platinum chain, hidden beneath Egyptian cotton and Italian wool. He'd stopped wearing it on his finger 6 months ago, claiming it caught on things during business meetings. She'd stopped asking him to put it back on 3 months after that, when it became clear that some battles weren't worth the energy required to lose them repeatedly. The study itself was Lorraine's design, chosen during the renovation Mira hadn't been consulted about. Everything in this house bore her mother-in-law's fingerprints, the color palette of whites and grays, the furniture that prioritized appearance over comfort, the dinner invitations that arrived weekly with Mira's attendance assumed but never actually requested. Lorraine's presence saturated every room like perfume, expensive and suffocating. "Did you confirm with Mother about Thursday?" he asked, finally looking up. His face was handsome in that careful way wealthy men often were, well-maintained, professionally groomed, expressing exactly what he chose to express and nothing more. Not yet. His jaw tightened, a micro-expression of disapproval. His phone buzzed again. Singapore wouldn't wait. Singapore never waited, and neither did Tokyo or London or wherever the next deal required his immediate attention. There was always somewhere else he needed to be, always a conversation more important than the one happening in front of him. Mira remembered different conversations. She remembered college version him showing up at her dorm with coffee and those ridiculous philosophy questions he loved. Would you rather know the day you'd die or the way you'd die? Would you rather lose all your memories or never make new ones? She remembered thrift store dates where they'd tried on terrible clothes and laughed until their stomachs hurt. She remembered the night he'd proposed, sitting on the floor of his first apartment, promising they'd choose each other every single day no matter what his family said, no matter what pressures came, no matter how much money complicated everything. When did he stop choosing me? The question rose unbidden, unwelcome. When did I become something to manage rather than someone to love? I have a call in 5 minutes, he said, which was both true and an exit strategy. We'll talk later. Later never came, though. Later had been postponed so many times it had ceased to exist as a real concept. Mira nodded and left him to his screen, to Singapore, to whatever required his attention more than his wife's presence. She climbed the stairs to their bedroom, separate beds now, his snoring the official excuse, and lay awake wondering when the cage had closed and why she'd stopped trying to find the key. Lorraine's penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Millennium Tower, all glass and steel and furniture so white it seemed to reject the very concept of human occupancy. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city spread beneath her like a kingdom she'd spent 60 years learning to rule. The view was strategic. She could see the financial district where her late husband had built their empire, the bay where old money kept their yachts, and if she looked carefully, the general direction of Pacific Heights where her son lived with a woman who could never be enough. The manila folder sat on her glass desk, innocuous and devastating in equal measure. 3 weeks of surveillance photographs, each one time-stamped and annotated with professional precision. The private investigator she'd hired, discreet, expensive, morally flexible, had delivered exactly what she'd requested. Evidence of intimacy that could be interpreted exactly how she needed it interpreted. There was Mira in the hospital cafeteria, leaning across the table toward the widower, her hand almost touching his. There they were in the parking garage at 7:15 p.m., standing close enough that their shadows merged under the fluorescent lighting. Another shot captured them through the window of the pediatric ward, Mira's expression soft in a way it never was at family dinners, the widower's hand on her shoulder. None of it proved anything, of course. Lorraine had reviewed the images with the cold assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading people and situations for leverage. The conversations were clearly professional. The proximity was explicable. The body language suggested compassion, not passion. But that was the beauty of a well-constructed lie. It didn't need to prove anything. It only needed to plant doubt in soil already prepared to receive it. She was protecting her son, she told herself, reaching up to touch her pearl necklace once, twice. The gesture that had comforted her through board meetings and hostile negotiations and the terrible year after her husband's death. The legacy her family had built over 3 generations couldn't be entrusted to a woman who chose pediatric nursing over proper society, who wore her emotions like costume jewelry, who'd never understood that marriage at their level was about strategic alliance, not romantic sentiment. Mira had been a mistake from the beginning, a phase her son should have outgrown before the wedding, and Lorraine had been patient for 4 years waiting for him to recognize it himself. Patience had limits, though. Methodology mattered. She'd spent 2 months crafting the letter that now sat in the folder's interior pocket, practicing Mira's handwriting from samples obtained through carefully staged thank you notes. The content was perfect, intimate enough to damn, vague enough to be believed, with just enough small errors that someone who truly knew Mira might notice, but her son, who'd stopped really seeing his wife years ago, would miss entirely. She'd written it as though Mira were confessing to a friend, describing feelings she shouldn't have for a patient's father, guilt over emotional infidelity, even if nothing physical had happened yet. The yet was crucial. It suggested inevitability. It transformed innocent coffee conversations into a trajectory that any husband would feel compelled to stop. Lorraine's phone sat beside the folder, her son's contact information already pulled up. She would call him tomorrow, she decided. Not today. Too eager. Tomorrow, with that particular tone of maternal concern she'd perfected, the one that made her worries sound like wisdom and her manipulations sound like love. She'd mentioned seeing Mira at the hospital during her charity board visit, how close she'd seemed with one of the fathers, how Lorraine certainly wasn't suggesting anything but perhaps he should pay attention, perhaps he should ask questions, perhaps he should protect himself before he got hurt. The most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in love. Agree or disagree. Because Lorraine wrapped hers in maternal devotion, in family legacy, in the conviction that she alone knew what was best for her son. She touched her pearls again, reassuring herself that what she was doing was necessary, was protective, was justified by the standards of a world where power and position mattered more than the hearts broken in their preservation. The city glittered below her, oblivious and beautiful, full of people making choices and living consequences. Tomorrow, she would make a phone call. Next week, she would plant the letter where her son would find it. And within the month, she would eliminate the unsuitable wife who'd never belonged in their world anyway, all while maintaining the perfect facade of concerned motherhood. She'd protected her family's interests for decades. This was simply one more necessary move in a game she'd been playing since before Mira was born, and Lorraine had never lost yet. Mira knew something was catastrophically wrong the moment she came downstairs and found her husband waiting in the living room instead of barricaded in his study. He sat on the white sofa Lorraine had selected, the one with fabric so pristine it seemed to reject the concept of actual human use, with his hands clasped between his knees and an expression she'd seen him wear during hostile acquisitions. The living room was neutral territory, public space within their own home, and his choice of location was a declaration in itself. This was serious, this was formal, this was the end of something. "We need to talk," he said, and those 4 words carried the weight of every marriage that had ever collapsed under their pressure. He reached for the folder on the coffee table, manila, unremarkable, devastating, and pulled out photographs that fanned across the white surface like evidence at a crime scene. Mira saw herself in the hospital cafeteria, leaning toward the widower whose daughter was fighting for her life. She saw herself in the parking garage, standing close enough that their shadows merged. She saw herself through the pediatric ward window, her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of comfort that looked, from the right angle with the right malicious intent, like something else entirely. The timestamps were highlighted in yellow: 7:40 to 5 p.m., 9:30 p.m., 11:15 p.m., each one carefully chosen to suggest impropriety, each one stripped of the context that would explain why a pediatric oncology nurse might spend evening hours with a terrified father whose 6-year-old was dying. "Your mother hired someone to follow me," Mira said, her voice flat with the kind of calm that preceded storms. She didn't phrase it as a question because it wasn't one. Lorraine's fingerprints were all over this. The professional surveillance, the strategic timing, the manipulated presentation designed to wound rather than illuminate. "That's what you're focusing on." His voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding through his corporate composure. "Not the fact that you've been spending hours with another man." "Lily had a panic attack," Mira interrupted, pointing to the cafeteria photo. "That timestamp, right after we got her heart rate stabilized. I bought her father coffee because he'd been awake for 36 hours and was about to collapse." She picked up another photo. The parking garage at 9:30. "This one, the night she coded. He was terrified and I stayed with him until she was stable because that's what decent human beings do for each other when children are dying." She watched his face, looking for recognition, for trust, for some indication that 4 years of marriage counted for something against his mother's poison. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice, as though he couldn't fathom why his wife might keep her daily life private. Mira laughed, a sound without humor. "I did, 3 months ago. Lily was admitted in October. I came home and told you about this brilliant little girl fighting leukemia, about her father trying to hold everything together, about how much it reminded me of—" She stopped, touching the locket at her throat. "You said that's nice and returned to your laptop. Singapore couldn't wait." His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. How could he? The distance between them had been built on 10,000 small dismissals, 10,000 moments when her life had mattered less than his next deal. "That doesn't explain the hours," he said, gesturing at the timestamps. "Midnight isn't office hours, Mira. Midnight isn't office hours for people with regular jobs," she shot back. "But dying children don't respect schedules and neither does terror. You want to audit my compassion? Fine. The wedding ring under your shirt right now, explain that. Don't talk to me about what's fair." She watched him touch his collar reflexively, confirming what she already knew. The ring hung there on its chain, hidden from the world, a symbol of commitment he was too ashamed or too practical to display publicly. Mira picked up the photographs again, studying them with the analytical eye of someone trained to notice details. The angles were too perfect, too deliberately misleading. In the cafeteria shot, Lily's high chair was cropped out. She'd been sitting right beside them, coloring while the adults talked. The parking garage image cut off at their waists, eliminating the hospital badges clearly visible on their lanyards. The window shot erased the machines, the IV poles, the entire medical context that would explain two people standing close in a pediatric cancer ward. "These are manipulated," she said quietly. "Not the images themselves, those are real, but the story they're telling is manufactured. Look at what's missing. Look at what's been deliberately removed to make innocent interactions look suspicious." She met his eyes, searching for the man she'd married beneath the stranger who'd taken his place. Ask yourself why your mother waited 3 weeks to show you. Ask yourself what she was waiting for, what she was hoping would happen in that time. If you're invested in Mira's fight for truth, show your support, hit that like button, and subscribe because this story is about to get intense. She's standing in her living room being accused of infidelity by a man who hides his wedding ring, confronting evidence manufactured by a mother-in-law who's played the long game perfectly. The question is whether truth matters when lies are wrapped in maternal concern. Mira set the photographs down and walked toward the stairs, her heart fracturing with every step. Behind her, she heard him pick up his phone. Singapore, probably, or Tokyo, or anywhere that wasn't this room where his marriage was disintegrating. She'd answered his accusations. She'd explained her innocence. But explanation wasn't the same as belief, and she could see in his face that Lorraine had already won. The real question was what Mira would do about it. Ethan woke at 6 a.m. to the cold leather of his office couch pressing into his back, his suit wrinkled, his throat dry from sleeping without water. He'd spent the night replaying his fight with Mira, the sharp edge of her words about him not listening looping in his head like a broken record. He'd wanted to believe her, truly he had. But the photos had been too clear, the timestamps too specific, the absence of Lily in every frame too noticeable. He'd fallen asleep with the image of her hand almost touching the widower's shoulder burned into his memory. The manila envelope was on his desk when he sat up, no return address, sealed with a plain stamp that didn't match any he recognized. It sat there like a challenge, like a secret he wasn't sure he wanted to open. He hesitated for a full minute before reaching for it, his fingers fumbling slightly as he tore the seal. Inside were enhanced copies of the same photos, this time with yellow highlighter circling the timestamps. 7:15 p.m. in the parking garage, 1:02 p.m. in the hospital hallway, 12:34 a.m. outside the widower's car. And beneath them, a single sheet of paper folded neatly in half. It was a letter, written in handwriting that looked almost exactly like Mira's. "Daniel, last night meant more than you know. It began, I've never felt seen like this, not even by him. You understand what it means to love someone who's fighting to stay here, to hold on when every part of you wants to let go. You're the light in the darkness, and I don't know how to go back to pretending I'm happy in a life that doesn't fit." Ethan's chest tightened. He knew Mira's handwriting. He'd spent hours reading her college notes, her love letters, the grocery lists she left on the fridge. She never dotted her I's with hearts. She hated phrases like light in the darkness. Those were small details, easy to miss if you weren't looking. But he'd been looking at her handwriting for 10 years. Still, the words felt like a punch to the gut, like a confirmation of every fear his mother had planted in his head. The office door opened, and Lorraine stepped in, carrying a tray of coffee and pastries from his favorite bakery. She looked like she hadn't slept either, her eyes red-rimmed, her expression soft with maternal concern. "I heard you were here all night," she said, setting the tray down on the desk. "I wanted to make sure you had something to eat." Ethan didn't look up. "How did you know I was here?" "I called the housekeeper. She said you never came home." Lorraine pulled out a chair beside him, her voice dropping to that gentle, understanding tone she used when she wanted to manipulate him. "I know this is hard. I know you loved her, but she's a nurse from nowhere, Ethan. You reconnect with her right when your company goes public. She moves into your home. And suddenly, she's spending all her time with a widower whose child is sick. It's not a coincidence." Ethan's phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Mira, heading into surgery with Lily. "Wish us luck. Love you." He stared at the words for a long time, his thumb hovering over the reply button. He wanted to type "love you too," wanted to tell her he was sorry, wanted to believe that none of this was real. But the letter was in his hand, the photos were on his desk, and his mother was sitting beside him telling him exactly what he'd been afraid to admit. He typed "be safe" and hit send. Lorraine reached across the desk and touched his hand. "You need to protect yourself," she said. "Call Harrison Ward. He'll know what to do." Ethan did. He called Harrison an hour later, his voice steady despite the fact that his hands were shaking. "Draw up the papers," he said. "The prenup is void if she's unfaithful, right?" Harrison confirmed it. "I'll need all the evidence," he said. "Photos, letters, anything you have." Ethan hung up the phone and reached into his desk drawer, pulling out an old prom photo. He was wearing a cheap suit. Mira was in a dress she'd borrowed from her roommate, and they were standing in front of a convenience store, grinning like they owned the world. That was before money, before expectations, before he'd stopped choosing her every day. What would you do in Ethan's position? Trust or verify? Comment below. Because Ethan was about to make a choice that would destroy everything he'd ever loved, and he had no idea that the evidence in his hand was a lie crafted by the woman who claimed to love him most. The hospital cafeteria at 3 in the afternoon was nearly empty, just the hum of refrigerators and the distant clatter of dishes being washed in the back. Mira sat alone at a corner table, her untouched sandwich curling at the edges, her phone face down beside her coffee. Lily's surgery had been successful, 8 hours of bone marrow transplant that had gone exactly as planned. But Mira felt nothing except a hollow numbness that had settled in her chest 3 days ago when her husband stopped coming home. He'd sent texts, "Working late, don't wait up." Then just late. Then nothing at all. Callista dropped into the chair across from her, still in her scrubs, her expression the careful blend of concern and pragmatism that came from 10 years of pediatric nursing. "You need to eat," she said, pushing the sandwich closer. "And you need to talk to him." "I tried." Mira's voice was flat. "He won't answer my calls." "Then go to his office, introduce him to the widower, prove there's nothing there." Callista leaned forward, her tone urgent. "Make him see you're not what his mother is painting you to be." Mira looked up, and for the first time in days, something like anger flickered in her eyes. "I can't make him choose me, Callista. I've been trying for 6 years. I moved into his world, learned his language, wore the right clothes to the right dinners, smiled at his mother's criticisms. I've been choosing him every single day while he hides his wedding ring under his shirt. I'm tired." The words hung between them, heavy with exhaustion and resignation. Callista opened her mouth to respond, but movement at the cafeteria entrance caught both their attention. A man in a cheap suit was scanning the room, holding a manila envelope, his posture screaming official business. His eyes landed on Mira, and he started walking toward their table with the deliberate pace of someone delivering bad news. "Mira Hayes?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. She nodded slowly, her stomach dropping. "You've been served." He placed the envelope on the table, turned, and walked away without another word. Mira stared at it for a full 10 seconds before her hands moved of their own accord, tearing the seal, pulling out the documents. "Petition for dissolution of marriage" was printed across the top in bold letters, filed by plaintiff Harrison Ward on behalf of... She couldn't read the rest. The words blurred together as the cafeteria suddenly felt too bright, too loud, too full of witnesses to her humiliation, served at work, where her colleagues could see, where patients' families could whisper, where the public degradation would be complete and documented. Callista grabbed her hand. "Mira, I need a minute." Mira stood, her movements mechanical, and walked to the supply closet down the hall. She locked the door behind her, leaned against the shelves of bandages and antiseptic, and let herself cry for exactly 2 minutes. Silent tears that she counted like heartbeats, holding herself together through force of will alone. Then she fixed her makeup in the reflection of a metal cabinet, smoothed her scrubs, and walked back out into the hallway like nothing had shattered. Lily was awake when Mira entered her room, propped up on pillows despite the fresh surgical site, working on another drawing. This one was a purple butterfly with wings so elaborate they covered half the page. "We're all magic," Lily announced, holding it up. "That's what you told me, remember?" Mira sat on the edge of the bed, her professional smile firmly in place. "I remember." "Is Mr. Mira sad?" Lily asked, her 6-year-old intuition cutting straight through every defense Mira had constructed. "Because he doesn't know your magic yet?" The question hit like a physical blow. Mira touched the locket at her throat, thought about her brother who died too young, thought about all the children she'd loved and lost and kept loving anyway. "Maybe," she said softly. Lily set down her drawing and took Mira's hand with the seriousness of someone far older than her years. "Don't worry. When people are scared, they forget to see the good stuff, but they remember. Eventually." Mira made a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'll always be here for you, sweetheart." Because even if her marriage was ending, even if her husband had chosen his mother's lies over her truth, she could still be magic for the children who needed her. That had to be enough. This story gets deeper. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. And drop a comment. Are you Team Mira or Team Ethan right now? Because the dissolution papers were just the beginning, and the truth was about to come out in the most devastating way possible. Harrison Ward's office occupied the corner suite of the tallest building in the financial district, all dark wood and leather furniture that smelled like old money and older power. The conference table was covered in evidence, surveillance photos arranged in chronological order, the forged letter in a plastic evidence sleeve, witness statements typed on cream-colored stationery that bore the letterhead of Lorraine's country club. Harrison stood at the head of the table like a general surveying a battlefield, his expression confident in the way that came from 30 years of winning cases that should have been lost. "The timeline is airtight," Harrison said, tapping one of the enhanced photos. "We have metadata showing she was with him on nights she claimed to be working late. We have the letter in her handwriting. We have 3 witnesses who saw them together outside the hospital, including Mrs. Pemberton, who sits on the board of St. Catherine's and has known your family for 20 years. Ethan sat at the opposite end of the table, his tie loosened, his face pale under the recessed lighting. He'd barely slept in a week, surviving on coffee and the gnawing certainty that something about this felt wrong even if all the evidence said otherwise. "What if I'm making a mistake?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. "What if there's an explanation I'm not seeing?" Harrison's expression shifted to something between patience and frustration. "Then you apologize. You tear up the papers, you beg forgiveness, you go to marriage counseling. But if you're right and you do nothing, if she's playing you and you ignore it, you lose everything your father spent 40 years building. The prenup protects the company, but only if we can prove infidelity. Otherwise, California community property laws apply, and she walks away with $500 million enterprise." The number hung in the air like a threat. Ethan's father had built that company from a single software contract into a tech empire that employed 3,000 people. The idea that it could be dismantled in a divorce settlement, divided like common property, felt like a betrayal of everything the old man had sacrificed. His father had died of a heart attack at his desk, working until the last possible moment, trusting that his son would protect what he'd built. Lorraine entered the conference room carrying another folder, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with military precision. "I brought the enhanced metadata analysis," she said, setting it on the table. "The timestamps match perfectly with the nights she told you she was working overtime. And I spoke with the hospital administrator. There's no record of her clocking in past 9 p.m. on any of those dates." Ethan felt something crack inside him. He remembered Mira at his father's funeral, standing beside him in the rain, while society friends offered hollow condolences. He remembered her during the company's near bankruptcy 5 years ago, when creditors were circling and board members were jumping ship. How she'd held him through panic attacks at 3 in the morning and never once suggested he give up. He remembered choosing her when he was nobody, when his father's company was struggling and his bank account was overdrawn, when she could have dated anyone but picked the anxious programmer who quoted philosophy and wore thrift store suits. But the photos were right in front of him. The letter was in her handwriting, almost perfectly, just different enough that he might have imagined the discrepancies. The late nights were documented. The distance between them had been growing for years. measured in separate beds and unfinished conversations, and a wedding ring he'd stopped wearing where anyone could see it. "Everyone has an angle," Lorraine said softly, placing her hand on his shoulder in that maternal gesture of comfort that had soothed him through childhood's scraped knees and adult failures. "I know you want to believe she's different, but she married you right when the IPO was announced. She moved into your home, spent your money, and then started spending time with a widower who needs financial help for his daughter's medical bills. The pattern is classic." Harrison shuffled the papers into a neat stack. "I've requested a court date, 6 weeks from today. That gives us time to depose witnesses, compile additional evidence, and build an airtight case. If she contests, we'll be ready. If she doesn't." He shrugged. "Then we'll know she knows she's caught." Ethan stared at the photos, at the woman who looked like his wife but felt like a stranger, at the evidence that proved betrayal even while his heart insisted there had to be another explanation. 6 weeks. 42 days to either save his company or destroy his marriage. He signed the document Harrison placed in front of him, authorizing the legal team to proceed, and wondered when exactly he'd stop believing that love could be enough to overcome the weight of money and suspicion. The apartment Mira had moved into was nothing like the Pacific Heights mansion. A studio in the Tenderloin with water-stained ceilings and a radiator that clanked through the night. She sat cross-legged on the second-hand futon, the divorce petition spread across her lap like an autopsy report of her marriage. The terms were brutal in their simplicity. No alimony, no settlement, no claim to any assets acquired during the marriage. 6 years of her life reduced to legal boilerplate, erased as though they'd never happened. The prenup she'd signed without reading, because she'd trusted him, because she'd believed love meant not needing insurance policies. Now guaranteed she'd walk away with exactly what she'd brought into the marriage, which was nothing except student loan debt and a nursing degree. Her attorney sat across from her on a folding chair, a tired woman from the free legal aid clinic who handled 50 cases like this every month. "We can fight this," she said, flipping through hospital employment records. "Your timesheets prove you were working those nights. We can subpoena the surveillance footage, get testimony from colleagues. The metadata on those photos can be challenged, timestamps can be manipulated. And that letter?" She held it up to the light. "A handwriting expert could tear this apart in 30 seconds. Mira stared at the document, at the words, "Respondent's alleged infidelity," printed in cold legal language. Fighting meant exposing everything. It meant dragging Lily's medical records into court, explaining why a 6-year-old leukemia patient needed her nurse to stay past midnight during panic attacks that left her gasping and crying for her dead mother. It meant putting the widower on the stand, forcing him to relive his wife's death while lawyers questioned whether his grief was genuine or convenient. It meant weaponizing private pain for public vindication. "I can't," Mira said quietly. Her attorney blinked. "Can't what?" "I can't use Lily's records. I can't put her family through a deposition. These people are already living through hell. I won't make it worse just to prove I'm innocent." The attorney set down her pen with the careful patience of someone who'd heard every bad decision justified with noble intentions. "You understand what you're giving up? Your husband is worth over $1 billion. You're entitled to—" "I'm entitled to nothing I didn't earn." Mira's voice was firm despite the way her hands shook. "And I won't earn it by destroying a child's privacy or a father's dignity. If that means I lose, then I lose." Callista showed up an hour after the attorney left, carrying takeout that neither of them would eat. She took one look at Mira's face and understood immediately. "You're not fighting. I'm not using Lily as a defense exhibit. You're letting her win." Callista's frustration filled the tiny apartment. "Lorraine set you up, fabricated evidence, destroyed your marriage, and you're just going to accept it. Mira, you're allowed to defend yourself." Mira touched the locket at her throat, once, twice, 3 times, the gesture that had comforted her through every impossible situation since her brother died. "I'm choosing not to weaponize a dying child," she said. "That's not losing. That's being human. Samuel would have understood that. He'd have told me that some things matter more than winning." The widower called that evening, his voice urgent over the phone. I heard about the divorce. Callista told me. Mira, I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. About Lily's panic attacks, about why you stayed, about how you saved my daughter's life a dozen times over. I'll make them understand there was never anything inappropriate between us. Mira closed her eyes against the offer, against the temptation to let someone else carry the burden of her defense. Lily doesn't need courtroom trauma, she said. She's 8 weeks post-transplant. Her immune system is compromised. The last thing she needs is lawyers asking her father questions about me while she's trying to survive. She needs peace, stability, and medical care without added stress. But you'll lose everything. I've already lost everything that mattered. The words came out more honest than she'd intended. My husband believed his mother over me. He filed for divorce without asking for my side of the story. The money, the house, the lifestyle, none of that was ever really mine anyway. But Lily's recovery? Her chance at a normal childhood after this is over? That's something I can protect. So I'm going to... She hung up before he could argue further, before his gratitude could make her second-guess the decision that felt equal parts right and devastating. Mira's protecting others at her own expense. Would you do the same? Let me know your thoughts. Because the court date was 5 weeks away, and she'd just decided to walk into it unarmed, choosing silence over vindication, privacy over victory, humanity over the scorched earth warfare that billionaire divorces usually demanded. Whether that made her noble or foolish remained to be seen, but it was the only choice she could live with when she looked at herself in the mirror each morning and touched the locket containing her brother's photograph. The Pacific Heights mansion had never felt larger than it did in Mira's absence. Every room echoed with the particular silence that comes from someone important being gone, a void that no amount of imported furniture or expensive art could fill. Ethan walked through the house at midnight, unable to sleep in the bed they'd once shared, cataloguing all the small ways she'd existed in a space designed to erase her. There was the college sweatshirt she'd left draped over the reading chair in the library, faded and stretched from a decade of wear. The thrift store coffee mug with the chipped handle that she'd insisted on using despite the cabinet full of crystal. Library books stacked on the side table, their margins filled with her handwriting. Observations about pediatric care, quotes she wanted to remember. Little hearts drawn next to passages that moved her. Her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. When she'd lived here, she'd moved through these rooms quietly, accommodating herself to a world that had no space carved out for a nurse who worked double shifts and wore her emotions like jewelry. Now that she was gone, the house screamed with everything he'd failed to notice while she was here. The lilies his mother kept sending, fresh ones arrived every Monday, suddenly seemed aggressive, deliberate. Had Mira ever mentioned being allergic? He couldn't remember. He couldn't remember the last real conversation they'd had that wasn't about his mother's dinner schedule or his business travel. Grayson Innovation was struggling without his focus. Board meetings ran long because he couldn't make decisions, investor calls were rescheduled because he couldn't concentrate, and the development timeline for their flagship product had been pushed back 3 times in as many weeks. The company his father had built, the legacy he was supposed to protect, was suffering because he couldn't stop replaying the look on Mira's face when she'd analyzed those surveillance photos and asked him why his mother had waited 3 weeks to show them. Lorraine had increased her presence, appearing at the office unannounced with coffee and concern, staying for strategy sessions she'd never attended before. "I'm helping, darling," she said, when he'd suggested she didn't need to come so often. "You're in no state to manage alone. Your father would have wanted me to step in when you needed support." She touched her pearls as she said it, that familiar gesture of comfort and control, and something about it had made his stomach turn. Late one night, unable to work, unable to sleep, he'd started scrolling through his text history with Mira. Months of messages painted a devastating picture. Her asking about his day, him responding with, "Fine." Her sharing stories about patients, him replying, "That's nice." Her inviting him to hospital fundraisers, him declining with, "Too busy." Her telling him she loved him leaving it on, read. The effort was all hers, the indifference all his, and seeing it laid out in blue and grey bubbles made him feel sick with recognition. He'd almost put the phone down when he noticed a voicemail notification from 6 months ago. He'd never listened to it, probably received it during a meeting, forgot about it, let it disappear into the digital void. Now he pressed play, and heard Mira's voice, soft and tired, and heartbreakingly hopeful. "Hey, it's me. I know you're busy with the Singapore expansion, and I know your mother needs help with the charity gala. Today is Samuel's anniversary, 22 years since he died, and I spent the day with Lily, who reminds me so much of him. She's fighting so hard, and her dad is trying so hard, and I just needed to hear your voice. I miss you. I miss us. I know things have been difficult, and I know I'm not what your mother wanted for you, but I'm still here. I'm always here. I love you." The message ended with a soft click. Ethan played it again, then a third time. Each repetition was a knife in his chest because he remembered that day now. He'd been in a meeting with investors when she'd called, had silenced his phone and forgotten about the voicemail entirely. He'd come home to find her asleep on the couch, still in her scrubs, and he'd gone straight to his study without waking her. His hand moved unconsciously to his collar, to the chain where his wedding ring hung hidden beneath shirt and tie, and all the layers of protection he'd built between himself and the vulnerability of being truly married. When had hiding become easier than fighting? When had he started choosing his mother's approval over his wife's presence? When had the distance between them grown so vast that he could believe she'd betray him without even asking for her side of the story? The house settled around him with the creaks and sighs of expensive construction. And somewhere in the silence, a truth he'd been avoiding started to crystallize. The evidence against Mira required him to believe she was someone she'd never been, while the evidence of their marriage required him to admit he'd become someone he'd never wanted to be. The courtroom was all wood paneling and harsh fluorescent lighting that made everyone look either guilty or exhausted, sometimes both. Mira sat alone at the respondents' table, wearing a simple navy dress she'd bought from a department store clearance rack, her silver locket visible against her collarbone like a talisman. Her legal aid attorney had withdrawn 2 days before the hearing, citing a conflict of interest that Mira suspected had more to do with a phone call from someone with money and influence than any actual ethical concern. So she sat there representing herself, a nurse with no legal training facing down a billion-dollar divorce machine, armed with nothing except the truth and a stubborn refusal to weaponize a sick child's medical records. Across the aisle, it might as well have been miles, sat her husband in a designer suit that cost more than 3 months of her current rent. Harrison Ward sat beside him, leather briefcase open, documents arranged with military precision. Behind them in the gallery sat Lorraine, wearing pearls and a white silk blouse, her expression radiating the satisfied calm of someone watching a plan come together exactly as designed. She'd invited her society friends to witness the proceedings, and they filled the first 2 rows like a jury of social judgment, their whispers carrying. Across the courtroom, every time they assessed Mira's off-the-rack dress or simple jewelry, or the audacity of a nurse thinking she belonged in their world, the judge entered, a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every manipulation, every lie, every performance that divorce proceedings inspired. She took her seat, arranged her papers, and looked out over the courtroom with the weary patience of someone who knew exactly how this would go and wasn't particularly impressed by any of it. Harrison stood for the opening statement, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 3 decades winning unwinnable cases. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mrs. Grayson engaged in an extramarital affair with a patient's father, violating the terms of her prenuptial agreement and forfeiting any claim to marital assets. We have surveillance photographs documenting intimate meetings at irregular hours." He placed the first photo on the projector, Mira and the widower in the hospital cafeteria, their heads close together in conversation. "We have correspondence in Mrs. Grayson's handwriting expressing romantic feelings for this individual." The forged letter appeared on screen, her almost handwriting magnified for the entire courtroom to see. "And we have witness testimony establishing a pattern of deception regarding her whereabouts and activities. The prenuptial agreement is clear. Infidelity results in forfeiture of all claims. We ask the court to enforce those terms." The gallery murmured their approval, Lorraine's friends nodding to each other as though the case were already decided. Mira felt their judgment like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, reminding her that she'd never belonged in their world, and everyone had known it except her. The judge turned to Mira. "Mrs. Grayson, your opening statement." Mira stood, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. She had no legal training, no prepared speech, no strategy except honesty delivered as clearly as she could. Manage. Your Honor, I'm a pediatric oncology nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital. I work with children who are fighting cancer, and I work with their families who are fighting to hold themselves together while their children suffer. The photos you're seeing are from the hospital where I work. The man in those pictures is the father of one of my patients, a 6-year-old girl with leukemia who had severe anxiety and needed extra support during her treatment. I spent late nights with her and her father because that's my job. That's my calling. It's what I've dedicated my entire adult life to doing, and I won't apologize for it. Those late nights weren't an affair. They were medical care delivered with compassion to people who desperately needed it. Her voice steadied as she continued, strengthened by the truths she was telling, even if it wasn't strategic, even if it wouldn't win her anything except the ability to sleep at night. I understand that to people who don't work in healthcare, those hours might seem suspicious. But to anyone who's ever sat with a scared child at midnight, who's ever held a father's hand while his daughter was in surgery, who's ever chosen, this profession knowing it means giving pieces of yourself to patients who might not survive. Those hours are normal, they're necessary, and they're something I'd do again tomorrow, regardless of what this court decides about my marriage. The gallery whispered louder now, their judgment shifting from certain to uncertain, and Mira sat down knowing she'd said everything she could say without exposing Lily to courtroom scrutiny. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen, but at least she'd spoken her truth in a room designed to obscure it. Lorraine took the stand with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent 60 years commanding rooms through sheer force of presence. She wore her grief like couture, perfectly tailored, strategically displayed, designed to evoke sympathy without appearing desperate for it. Her hand rested on the Bible during swearing in, her voice steady and clear as she promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help her God. Harrison approached her with the deference of a skilled attorney who knew his witness had been coached to perfection. Mrs. Hayes, can you describe your relationship with your daughter-in-law? Harrison began, his tone gentle, inviting confession rather than interrogation. Lorraine's expression shifted to maternal concern, her fingers finding her pearls in that unconscious gesture of comfort. I tried to welcome Mira into our family. I truly did, but over the past year, I noticed a distance growing between her and my son. She was always working late, always unavailable for family obligations. As a mother, you notice these things, you feel them. What prompted you to hire a private investigator? I did what any mother would do when she sees her child in pain. Lorraine's voice carried just the right blend of defensiveness and righteousness. My son was working himself to exhaustion trying to save his father's company, and his wife was never there to support him. I needed to know if my concerns were justified or if I was simply being an overprotective parent. So, yes, I hired an investigator, not to destroy anyone, but to understand what was happening in my son's marriage. Harrison placed the first surveillance photo on the projector. And what did the investigation reveal? Multiple late-night meetings with the same man, in parking garages, in hospital cafeterias at irregular hours, private conversations that looked nothing like professional medical care. Lorraine's tone suggested reasonable concern, rather than malicious intent. What else could it be? What innocent explanation exists for a married woman spending midnight hours alone with another man? And this letter? Harrison held up the forged document in its evidence sleeve, found in Mira's vehicle by the investigator during a routine surveillance. Her own handwriting, her own words expressing romantic feelings for this individual. Lorraine shook her head slowly, performatively sad. I showed it to my son because he deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful. Harrison nodded with satisfaction and returned to his seat. The judge looked to Mira. Your witness, Mrs. Grayson. Mira stood, her hands trembling slightly as she approached the stand. She had no legal training, no courtroom experience, no strategy except asking the questions that had been burning in her mind since this nightmare began. When did you hire the investigator? She asked, her voice quieter than Harrison's but carrying a different kind of authority. The authority of someone seeking truth rather than victory. Lorraine's expression remained composed. Approximately 3 weeks before I showed the evidence to my son. Why wait 3 weeks? I wanted to be certain. To gather enough information that I wouldn't be making hasty accusations against my son's wife. The answer came smoothly, rehearsed. Or to build a narrative. Mira's question hung in the air like an accusation. Objection. Harrison stood, speculation and argumentative. Sustained, the judge said. Mrs. Grayson, stick to questions, not conclusions. Mira nodded, recalibrating. Do you know what I do at the hospital, specifically? Lorraine shifted slightly, the first sign of discomfort. You're a nurse, pediatrics, I believe. Do you know any of my patients' names? That's not relevant to whether you... Do you know why I wear this locket? Mira interrupted, her hand moving to the silver pendant at her throat. Harrison stood again. Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant to the allegations of infidelity. The judge studied Mira for a long moment, then turned to Lorraine. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mrs. Hayes. Lorraine's fingers tightened on her pearls. Sentimental reasons, I assume. A family heirloom, perhaps. It's my brother, Mira said, her voice breaking slightly. Samuel. He died of leukemia when he was 8 years old. I was 12. I watched him fight for 2 years, watched him lose weight and hair and hope, watched my parents fall apart trying to save him. I became a pediatric oncology nurse because of him. I stay late at the hospital. I hold scared children's hands at midnight. I support grieving fathers in parking garages. Not because I'm having an affair, but because I couldn't save Samuel. Because maybe, if I work hard enough, if I care enough, if I give enough of myself, I can help save someone else's brother, someone else's child, someone else's Samuel. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even Lorraine's society friends stopped whispering, their judgment suspended by the raw honesty of grief spoken aloud. The truth is coming. If you're feeling this, hit that like button. Because Mira had just exposed the heart of who she was to a room full of strangers, and Lorraine's carefully constructed narrative was beginning to show cracks in its foundation. Lorraine's composure faltered, just for a moment, just a slight tightening around her eyes. Before she recovered, her mask sliding back into place. But Mira had seen it, and so had the judge. And somewhere in that crack was the beginning of doubt about whose story deserved belief. Harrison called the private investigator to the stand with the confidence of someone who believed his evidence was bulletproof. The investigator was exactly what you'd expect, middle-aged, professional, dressed in a suit that suggested competence without ostentation. He took the oath and settled into the witness chair with the ease of someone who'd testified in dozens of cases, always on the winning side. Mr. Lawson, can you describe the nature of your investigation into Mrs. Grayson? Harrison asked, guiding his witness through the familiar territory of surveillance work. The investigator pulled out a leather-bound notebook, flipping to marked pages. I was hired to conduct surveillance on the respondent, Mira Grayson, to document her activities and associations. Over a 3-week period, I photographed her at various locations, primarily St. Catherine's Hospital, documenting meetings with a male individual later identified as the father of one of her patients. The photographs show repeated contact at irregular hours, consistent with the pattern Mrs. Lorraine Grayson had expressed concern about. Harrison placed the surveillance photos on the projector one by one, each timestamp clearly visible. And you can authenticate these photographs as accurate representations of what you observed. Yes, sir. Each photo is timestamped and GPS tagged. They represent a factual record of the respondent's activities during the surveillance period. Harrison nodded with satisfaction and returned to his seat. Your witness, Mrs. Grayson. Mira stood, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She'd noticed something while reviewing the evidence the night before, a discrepancy so obvious she'd assumed it was a typo. Now, standing in front of the investigator, she realized it might be the thread that would unravel everything. Mr. Lawson, what date did Mrs. Lorraine Grayson hire you? The investigator consulted his notebook. October 15th. And the first photo in your report? The one that starts the timeline of alleged infidelity. He flipped back a few pages. October 3rd. The courtroom went completely silent. Mira felt the weight of that silence, the sudden shift in atmosphere as people processed what they'd just heard. Could you repeat that? She asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. October 3rd. the investigator said, his professional demeanor beginning to crack as he realized what he'd just admitted. 12 days before I was hired. The courtroom erupted. Gallery whispers became audible conversations, Lorraine's society friends turning to each other with confusion and shock. The judge banged her gavel twice, calling for order, her expression shifting from weary patience to sharp attention. Harrison jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is clearly a clerical error. The dates must have been transposed during report preparation." "This is your evidence authentication, Counselor," the judge interrupted, her tone cutting. "You brought this witness to establish the reliability of your surveillance documentation. There's no room for clerical errors of this magnitude." Mira turned back to the investigator, pressing her advantage. "Mr. Lawson, did you take the photos from October 3rd through October 14th? "No, ma'am," he admitted, his professional composure completely gone now. "Then who did?" The investigator's gaze drifted to Lorraine in the gallery, then back to Mira. "I assumed Mrs. Grayson had conducted prior surveillance before officially hiring me. It's not uncommon for clients to gather preliminary evidence before engaging professional services." Mira turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to recall Lorraine Grayson to the stand." The judge nodded. "Mrs. Grayson, please return to the witness stand. I'll remind you that you're still under oath." Lorraine walked to the stand with her head high, her composure intact, but her eyes were calculating now, searching for the exit strategy in a trap she hadn't seen coming. She sat and folded her hands in her lap, touching her pearls once, twice, that familiar gesture of comfort now looking more like a tell. "You testified earlier that you hired the investigator out of concern for your son," Mira said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "But you had photos from 12 days before you hired him. How?" Lorraine's pause was barely perceptible, but it was there. "I may have conducted some preliminary observation myself, a mother's instinct. I wanted to be certain before spending money on professional surveillance." "You followed me yourself?" "I happened to see you at the hospital during one of my charity board visits. It raised questions about your activities." "What day did you happen to see me?" Mira asked, the quotation marks audible in her tone. Another pause, longer this time. "I don't recall exactly." "The photos are dated and time-stamped," Mira said, pulling the evidence sheets from her table. "October 3rd at the hospital cafeteria, October 5th in the parking garage, October 8th outside. The pediatric wing, October 10th, 12th, 14th, multiple locations, multiple times of day. You didn't happen to see me, Mrs. Grayson. You stalked me for 2 weeks, documented my every movement, and then hired a professional investigator to make your surveillance look legitimate." The gallery whispers grew to a roar. Even Lorraine's supporters were shifting uncomfortably, their expressions moving from judgment of Mira to uncertainty about the woman they'd defended. The judge banged her gavel again, but this time she let the noise continue for a moment longer. As though recognizing that some reactions couldn't and shouldn't be silenced, Mira pulled out her phone, holding it up. "I have hospital security logs, time-stamped entry and exit records. I was working every single one of those nights you photographed me, in the pediatric wing, with patients whose privacy I've protected throughout this entire proceeding, even though exposing their medical situations would have immediately proven my innocence." Harrison stood again. "Your Honor, hospital records can be manipulated by employees with access." "Counselor," the judge said, her voice sharp as broken glass, "you're not helping your case. Sit down." Mira turned back to Lorraine, feeling 6 years of accumulated silence finally finding voice. "And the letter, the one supposedly in my handwriting, expressing romantic feelings for a patient's father. When did you write that?" This is the moment everything changes. If you want to see justice, subscribe right now. You won't regret it. Because Lorraine's mask was cracking in real time, and the truth was about to come pouring through every fissure. Mira held up the forged letter, her hands steady now despite everything riding on this moment. "I never dot my I's with hearts," she said, her voice clear enough to reach every corner of the courtroom. "I haven't since middle school. It's a quirk I outgrew when my brother got sick and I started taking medical notes seriously. But this letter does. Look at it. Every single eye has a little heart above it. She walked to her table and retrieved a stack of documents, hospital charts, patient notes, personal journals spanning years. This is my handwriting, consistent across a decade of nursing practice. Patient care logs from St. Catherine's, medical charts I've filled out, personal notes I've written to colleagues. No, hearts, not one. Because when you're documenting whether a child's fever broke or their white blood cell count improved, you don't decorate your letters like a teenager writing love notes. Harrison stood, grasping for any foothold in the collapsing case. Your Honor, handwriting evolves over time. Personal correspondence differs from professional documentation. The letter mentions last night being meaningful, Mira interrupted, her momentum unstoppable now. Which night specifically? According to the date on the paper, this letter was supposedly written on October 10th, referencing the night before. October 9th. I worked a double shift that day, Counselor. 32 hours straight. One of my patients crashed. During the night, septic shock following chemotherapy. I never left the ICU. I was covered in someone else's child's blood at midnight, holding his mother while she sobbed, helping the attending physician bring his vitals back from critical. That was my October 9th. She produced the medical logs, walking them to the judge's bench. Time-stamped entry and exit from the pediatric intensive care unit, signed by 3 attending physicians who can verify I was present for the entire emergency. The only meaningful night I had was one where a 7-year-old boy almost died, and I helped save his life. The courtroom was silent except for the rustle of paper as the judge reviewed the logs. Mira turned back to face Lorraine, whose composed expression was beginning to fracture like ice under pressure. And this phrase, "You're the light in the darkness." I'm a pediatric oncology nurse. I don't use flowery metaphors. I use medical terminology and bad puns that make sick kids laugh. I tell them their blood counts are trending up and their nausea is totally normal for someone fighting so hard. I don't talk about light and darkness because I live in a world where children fight cancer, and you don't poeticize that kind of suffering. She held up the letter again, this time addressing the entire courtroom. This letter is a forgery, a bad one, created by someone who knows my handwriting well enough to copy it, but doesn't know me well enough to capture how I actually think or write. And the only person, with both the motive to forge it and the access to my handwriting samples, is the woman who hired an investigator to stalk me for 2 weeks before she claimed to be concerned about her son's marriage. Mira's gaze locked with her husband's across the aisle. He looked like he'd been physically struck, his face drained of color, his eyes wide with the dawning horror of understanding. His hand moved unconsciously to his collar, to the chain where his wedding ring hung hidden, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw him truly see her. Not as the woman his mother had painted, but as the person he'd promised to choose every single day and then stopped choosing altogether. The judge looked across the courtroom to where Ethan sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, his face ashen, his entire world visibly restructuring itself around the truth he'd been too blind to see. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone neutral but expectant, "do you wish your counsel to continue with this case?" Ethan stood slowly, his movements mechanical, like someone waking from a nightmare into a reality somehow worse. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'd like to speak." Harrison grabbed his arm. "Ethan, I strongly advise against making any statements without consulting. I'm withdrawing the petition." The words cut through Harrison's objection like a knife through paper. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gallery whispers becoming shouts, reporters scrambling for their phones, Lorraine's society friends turning to each other in shock and confusion. The judge banged her gavel once, twice, 3 times. "Order. Mr. Grayson, you're withdrawing the petition for dissolution of marriage?" "Yes, Your Honor." Ethan turned away from the judge, away from his attorney, away from the carefully constructed case that had just collapsed under the weight of manufactured evidence. He looked directly at Mira for the first time since the proceedings began, really looked at her, and his voice broke. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I believed the lies because they were easier than admitting I'd stopped fighting for us. Because facing the truth meant acknowledging that I'd become exactly what I swore I'd never be. Someone who chose convenience over commitment, who let money and status matter more than the person who loved me when I had neither." He turned to face his mother, who sat rigid in the gallery. Her pearls clutched in both hands now, her composure finally, completely shattered. "You did this," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "You manufactured evidence. You stalked my wife for 2 weeks. You forged a letter in her handwriting. You hired someone to create a false narrative of infidelity. You destroyed my marriage with calculated, deliberate lies." "Darling, I was protecting you," Lorraine started. But Ethan cut her off with a gesture so sharp it silenced the entire courtroom. "From what?" His voice rose, years of accumulated compliance transforming into fury. "From a woman who loved me when I had nothing, who held my hand at my father's funeral when your grief was too performative to notice mine, who stayed through the company's near bankruptcy, through every crisis, through my failures and fears, who chose me every single day while I hid my wedding ring under my shirt because wearing it publicly might inconvenience your social calendar." He pulled the chain from around his neck, the platinum ring catching the harsh courtroom lights. "You weren't protecting me, Mother. You were controlling me, just like you controlled Father, just like you've controlled every aspect of my life since the day I was born." The ring slipped from the chain into his palm. Ethan held it for a moment, feeling its weight, remembering the day Mira had placed it on his finger and he'd promised to choose her above everything else. Above family expectations, above money, above the comfortable cage his mother had spent decades constructing. He slid the ring onto his finger where it belonged, where it should have stayed, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for years finally released. "I choose her," he said, looking at Mira again, his eyes bright with tears he'd never allowed himself to shed in public. "I should have chosen her 6 years ago, every single day. When you criticized her profession, her background, her worth, I should have chosen her then. When you redecorated our home without asking her, when you scheduled dinners without consulting her, when you made her feel like a guest in her own life, I should have chosen her. I'm choosing her now." He turned back to the judge, his voice steady despite everything crumbling around him. "Your Honor, I'm withdrawing the petition for dissolution of marriage, and I'm filing a restraining order against my mother for harassment and stalking of my wife, effective immediately." Lorraine stood, her face pale, her carefully constructed world collapsing. "You can't be serious. I'm your mother. Everything I did was for your own good." "You're done," Ethan said simply. "You're done controlling my marriage, my company, my life. Security will escort you from the building, and if you attempt to contact either me or my wife again, I will pursue criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy." The courtroom fell silent, everyone watching the destruction of a relationship that had been toxic for far longer than anyone had admitted. The judge looked down from her bench, her expression carrying the weight of 30 years witnessing humanity at its worst and occasionally, rarely, at its redemptive best. "Petition for dissolution of marriage is dismissed," she said, her voice cutting through the lingering courtroom chaos. "Mrs. Lorraine Grayson, you're fortunate I'm not holding you in contempt for fraud, perjury, and abuse of these proceedings. The restraining order will be processed through separate channels, and I strongly suggest you retain separate legal counsel for what I imagine will be a complicated relationship with your son going forward." Lorraine stood, her composure completely shattered for the first time in anyone's memory. The society friends she'd invited to witness Mira's public humiliation now whispered among themselves, their judgment redirected, their phones already out to spread the story of her spectacular fall. She'd walked into this courtroom as a matriarch protecting family interests and was leaving as a cautionary tale about the cost of control. Her power had evaporated in the span of an hour, revealed as nothing more than manipulation dressed in maternal concern. She left without looking at her son, her heels clicking against the floor with the hollow sound of defeat. The gallery began to disperse, reporters rushing out to file stories, spectators discussing what they'd witnessed. Ethan stood frozen at the plaintiff's table until the room was nearly empty, then slowly crossed the aisle that had separated him from his wife. Mira remained at the respondent's table, her hands folded in her lap, her silver locket catching the light. She looked exhausted and vindicated, and heartbroken all at once. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, stopping a few feet away from her, respecting the distance his actions had created. "I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for a chance to earn back your trust, however long it takes, whatever it requires." Mira looked up at him. This man she'd loved through college poverty and corporate success, and the slow erosion of their marriage. "I never stopped loving you," she said quietly. "I just got tired of being the only one fighting, tired of choosing you every day while you chose everything else. I'm fighting now." He took a step closer, his wedding ring visible on his finger where it belonged. "I'm all in. No more hiding. No more choosing my mother's approval or the company's demands or social expectations over you. No more separate beds or unanswered voicemails or pretending that anything matters more than this marriage." Their hands met tentatively across the table, fingers intertwining with the careful hope of people who'd survived a war and were trying to remember what peace felt like. Mira's phone buzzed against the table, breaking the moment. She glanced at the screen and something like a smile crossed her face for the first time in weeks. A text from the widower reading, "Lily wants to know if Mr. Mira knows your magic yet." She turned the phone so her husband could read it, watching his expression shift from confusion to curiosity. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said, standing and gathering her documents. "A 6-year-old girl who's braver than both of us combined. She's been asking about you since the divorce papers arrived. I'd like you to understand the work I do, the people who matter to me, the life I've been living while you were too busy to notice." He nodded, following her lead, following her heart, finally choosing to see the woman he'd married instead of the image his mother had tried to replace her with. St. Catherine's Hospital looked different to him now. Walking through the pediatric wing beside Mira, her hand in his, her badge clipped to her scrubs and her silver locket catching the light, he understood for the first time that this place wasn't just where she worked. It was where she lived most fully, where she poured the best of herself into people who needed it desperately. He'd spent 6 years resenting the time this building claimed from their marriage without ever once trying to understand what it gave her in return. Lily was sitting up in bed, cancer-free for 4 months, wearing purple butterfly clips in the hair that had grown back soft and fine as dandelion fluff. She was working on a drawing when they entered, tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration, and when she looked up and saw Mira, her entire face transformed into pure joy. Then her eyes found the man standing beside her nurse, and she tilted her head with the frank assessment that only children could deploy without apology. "Is that Mr. Mira?" she asked. "That's him," Mira confirmed. Lily held up her drawing immediately, rotating it so he could see. She'd divided the page into 3 panels, the way a child tells the most important story of her life. "This is when Miss Mira saved my life," she explained, pointing to the first panel, which showed a figure in scrubs holding a small figure's hand, while numbers and lines that were clearly meant to be medical monitors surrounded them. "This is when Daddy cried happy tears," she continued, pointing to the second panel, a large figure and a small figure with water droplets raining upward, defying gravity the way happiness sometimes does. "And this is when I learned magic is real." The third panel was simply purple. Purple everywhere, filling every corner of the paper, with 2 words written in a 6-year-old's careful letters: "We're magic." Ethan's throat tightened in a way that hadn't happened since his father's funeral. He crouched down to Lily's eye level, something he'd watched Mira do instinctively and had never understood until this moment. "These are extraordinary," he said honestly. "You're a real artist." Lily studied him with those wise, ancient eyes that sick children sometimes develop from spending too long in the company of adult fears. "You're okay," she announced. "Miss Mira picks good people." The widower arrived a few minutes later, shaking Ethan's hand with the firm grip of someone who had nothing to perform and everything to mean. "Your wife is the reason my daughter is alive," he said, meeting Ethan's eyes directly. "Not just medically, though she's exceptional at what she does. She gave Lily hope during the months when hope was genuinely all we had left. She stayed past midnight not because of anything inappropriate, but because a terrified 6-year-old needed someone who understood what it felt like to love someone with this disease. Mira understood. She always understood." Standing in that hospital room, surrounded by crayon drawings and the particular fierce love that exists between people who've survived impossible things together, Ethan finally understood everything he'd failed to see. The late nights, the coffee, the parking garage conversations, the closeness that his mother had twisted into something unrecognizable. It had never been an affair. It had been Mira being exactly, completely, consistently who she'd always been. A healer who gave everything she had to the people who needed her, who wore her grief and her purpose in a silver locket close to her heart, who had chosen this calling long before she'd chosen him. He'd nearly destroyed the best person he'd ever known because he'd been too comfortable in his distance to question the narrative his mother placed in his hands. The Pacific Heights mansion sold within 2 weeks of listing. A tech executive paid $18 million without negotiating, and Ethan signed the papers without regret. Too many ghosts, he'd told the realtor. Too much marble. Too many rooms that echoed with his mother's decorating. Choices, and his own accumulated failures. They bought a house in a quieter neighborhood, a craftsman bungalow with a porch that sagged slightly, and a kitchen that needed updating, and windows that let in the kind of afternoon light that made everything look forgiving. Mira filled the windowsills with plants immediately, crowding them together in cheerful disorder. She brought the thrift store coffee mug from her studio apartment, placed it in the cabinet beside expensive mugs from his previous life, and it looked exactly right there. Grayson Innovation underwent restructuring in the months following the divorce proceedings. Lorraine's financial involvement was carefully legally unwound. Every dollar she'd contributed returned with interest. Every clause she'd inserted into company governance quietly removed. The company emerged smaller and more deliberate, stripped of the social climbing ambitions that had never been his anyway. His father had built a company that solved problems. That was what Ethan rebuilt, on his own terms, in his own image, without the invisible hand of his mother guiding decisions from behind closed doors. One evening, 3 months after the courtroom, he found Mira on the porch with her locket between her fingers. 1, 2, 3 touches, that anchoring ritual he'd watched without understanding for 6 years. He sat beside her and finally asked about Samuel properly, not the surface version but the real one. What he'd been like, what he'd loved, what he'd said in his last months that Mira still carried. She talked for 2 hours, and he listened, truly listened, for the first time in longer than he could admit. The next morning he gave her a gift, a second locket, its chain designed to intertwine with the first so they rested together against her collarbone. Inside he'd placed their wedding photo, the one from the courthouse where they'd looked at each other like nothing else existed. But beside it, folded impossibly small, was Lily's drawing. The purple one. "We're magic. You carry the people you save," he said. "Let me help carry them with you. I have room. I finally have room." She touched both lockets then, the old and the new, and didn't say anything for a long moment. She didn't need to. The Sunday dinners became a ritual that nobody planned and everyone attended. Not at Lorraine's penthouse, with its strategic view and white furniture and unspoken hierarchies, but at the craftsman bungalow with its sagging porch and mismatched chairs that they'd collected from various thrift stores over 3 Saturday mornings spent laughing at terrible furniture together. The widower came with Lily, who always brought drawings and always sat closest to Mira. Callista arrived with her fiancé, a quiet man who made excellent bread and said little but listened to everything. Nurses from St. Catherine's filled the remaining chairs, people who'd watched Mira fight alone and had never stopped believing in her. The table was too small, and the noise was considerable, and nothing matched, and it was the best room in the world. Ethan's wedding ring stayed on his finger through every dinner, visible and permanent, catching the candlelight while he passed dishes and refilled glasses and laughed at stories about hospital, mishaps and patient victories. He'd stopped hiding it the day he'd placed it back where it belonged in the courtroom, and he would never hide it again. Mira's smile across that crowded table was something he'd almost forfeited forever. Genuine, unguarded, completely free. The smile of a woman who was finally completely home. Some lies are built so carefully they look like love. But truth, real truth, doesn't need construction. It just needs courage. Mira found hers in the faces of children who counted ceiling tiles when they were scared, who drew their hope in purple crayon and called it magic. Ethan found his in the moment he almost lost everything that mattered, in a courtroom where his wife stood alone and told the truth to a room full of people determined not to hear it. And sometimes that's exactly what it takes, nearly losing everything, to finally see what you've had all along. If this story moved you the way it moved me in the telling, prove it. Smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that truth always wins, even when it takes time. Subscribe to Mr. Legacy Golden Stories because I bring you narratives that don't just entertain. They remind you what actually matters. Love, truth, courage, the choice to keep choosing the person worth choosing. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing in your truth? Have you ever stayed silent to protect someone else at your own expense? The way Mira refused to use Lily's story even when it would have saved her? Drop your experience in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories matter as much as the ones I tell. Where are you watching from today? Are you Team Mira, Team Ethan, who finally woke up? Let me know below, and tell me what moment in this story hit you hardest. And carry this question with you. What would you do if someone you loved believed a lie about you? Would you fight with everything you had? Or would you trust that truth finds its way on its own timeline? Think about it. Share your answer. And remember, the best stories aren't just the ones we watch. They're the ones we live with enough courage to tell the truth, even when it costs us everything. Until next time, this is Mr. Legacy, reminding you, your story matters. Make it legendary.